Okay, let me just. Okay, I think we're good to go. So I'm kind of conscious that a lot of the people who are on this call have probably heard bits and pieces, if not quite a lot, about Clactol already. So what I thought I'd do was kind of take a slightly different tack and maybe spend slightly less time on the details of the excavation and kind of really kind of rattle through that part of the project, as it were, and concentrate a bit more on the sort of latter stages of what we've been doing in the post-ex and really what that's sort of beginning to tell us in the sort of bigger picture sense, because that's really the stage we're at now. You'll probably appreciate that Clactol is one of these projects where we got so much information from the field work that, you know, any one of the subjects that I'm going to mention tonight could be the subject of a whole lecture on its own. So you'll forgive me for sort of glossing over some of the things that I could spend time explaining. But really, I think that what I'd like to do is just have a think about some of the sort of the larger scale conclusions that we're drawing from all this work. So what I'll do is I'll run through the project because I'm aware that not everyone will have seen the results and heard any of us from AOC or Historic Ascent speak about the project. So I will cover that, and then we'll have a look at the finds and the samples and the findings that are coming from the post-ex analysis stages. And then I'll spend a bit of time just talking about Clactol and where that fits into the bigger picture of what we know about the Appalachian in Scotland. So as I'm sure you all know, from those of you that I can see on the call, most of you have been there already, but this is Assynt right up in the northwest mainland on the west coast of Sutherland. The Broch is at Clactol Beach, where the campsite is, not far from the campsite, just on this peninsula of quite good, relatively good agricultural land for coastal Assynt. And that's not a coincidence. The Broch is very clearly sited to take advantage of that good agricultural land. And it sits on this kind of rocky knoll overlooking the bay and to the north. In terms of the structure, it's a fairly typical Broch in that it has a lot of the standard features. So we have the intramural guard cells, the complex entrance passage, the tall corbelled cells within the walls, the scarcement supporting the internal furnishings, and the stairs leading up to what would be the first and second floors in the original tower. That's already glossing over an awful lot of detail, but what I'm going to do is just sort of highlight some of the more important parts of the structure because they're important to the wider discussion that I'll come to a bit later. So this is how the building looks in plan. You can see the two guard cells either side of the entrance, the tall cell 2 on the down slope side of the building, and then the stairs leading up to the first floor landing in the gallery. Because of the kind of ludicrous position that the builders chose to occupy, the site is built over uneven bedrock. So the downslope side of the site almost has to accommodate the bedrock cleft. And that results in this kind of feature that we've been calling the souterrain. It's kind of like a lower curving passage in the Broch. And you can see, if I highlight this side of this photo on the right here, this lining wall lines the bedrock. It's immediately behind this dry stone wall, and then the photograph is taken from the wall head as it survives, some 3 meters up from the base of the interior. The cells themselves are interesting, and again, it's one of the many points that we could go into a lot of detail about the history of construction and rebuilding on the site. But one of the things I just want to draw attention to as I rattle through this overview of the structure is that you'll see in several of the areas, this is in cell 1, just to the south of the entrance passage. You see that the back of the cell here doesn't bond completely into the outer wall, and that's an important feature. It tells us that the two things weren't built together and there's been some rebuilding. Same sort of scenario applies in cell 2. You can see that this is the inner Broch wall here, and the interior walling of the cell doesn't neatly tie into it, so it's been partly rebuilt. So you know, the structure that we're looking at, the structure that we see on site now, is very much a kind of remodeled, reworked version of the original building as it was conceived. And again, this is just an important point that I want to emphasize as we come back to later. The excavation was great fun. We were lucky in that we had very well preserved occupation levels right down close to the bedrock. So these more or less comprised of superimposed flooring layers, organic flooring layers, surrounding a central hearth feature. So this is the kind of hearth mound during the excavation, with the baulks running through the occupation surfaces here. This is Gordon excavating just to the south of the hearth, and in fact there's many of you on this call in this photo. These hearths then, what the sequence seems to have been is that the central hearth was used until it became almost enveloped by the surrounding flooring. So instead of continually refurbishing the interior, it seems like the strategy was to keep dumping more material down onto the floor. So as things became sort of wet and sodden underfoot, there wasn't an awful lot of clearing out. It was mainly dumping more material and trampling that down. And eventually that resulted in the hearth becoming swallowed by the floor. And at that stage, they would just slap another hearth on top. So what we excavated through was 3 layers of hearth sequence, each with associated floors which had been repeatedly refurbished. So this is hearth 1, as in the latest hearth. Hearth 2, beneath that you can see the orange peat ash in the photo, and then hearth 3, the lowest one, which is right on the bedrock itself, and this is just surrounded by the very earliest flooring in the surviving deposits that we excavated. All of this rock surrounding the hearth here, that's bedrock, so we're right down onto the original first primary levels of this phase of the occupation. You can see that the first hearth, unlike the later 2, is very much center in the building. So you can imagine that was sort of laid out almost as they were designing the rebuilt structure. Just to illustrate the character of the floors, these are sort of wet, soggy, or highly organic, not very much inorganic material in here at all. So it's things like grasses and reeds and that kind of thing trampled down into the flooring. And you can see these interleaved bands of red peat ash. So this is hearth rakeouts and debris from the sort of ongoing use of the hearth, intermingling with floor layers which are trampled down, become wet, and then are again refurbished. So the great thing about this is, you know, some archaeological sites, we lose that kind of information because the flooring tends to be eroded, it tends to be worn away, or it tends to be shoveled out. So the fact that we've got this sort of accretive process of floors being dumped on top of floors has meant that we've got so much information out of this sort of microscopic level of preservation in these floors. So this is those samples looked at in thin section, and the soil micromorph report for the flooring layers in this building alone is probably the size of an average archaeological monograph. There's just so much detail in here, but what it's showing is this repeated sort of sequence of floor trampling, refurbishment, and the intermingling of occupation debris, fragments of burnt bone, roundwood charcoal coming from the hearth. And in no way were these floors kept clean. There's evidence of rodent disturbance all the way through them, probably contemporary with the occupation in the Broch, but also more sort of bizarre deposits. So we have, this is actually 2 sheep, semi-articulated sheep skeletons. So these things were buried in the floor, in amongst all this organic debris, while there was still flesh and sinew on these bones. So we can only imagine that, it must have been fairly unpleasant. I mean, it's hard to see how that kind of deposit wouldn't have caused some quite smelly and unpleasant conditions inside the Broch. But this is obviously not, these people aren't obsessed with cleanliness. They're just throwing more flooring on top and carrying on. And that is in contrast to some other Iron Age sites that we know of where similar flooring sequences are preserved. Again, I'm moving at pace here because I want to get on to the discussion parts of the project. But one of the most important aspects of the Clachtol excavation was that what ended the occupation was this burning event. So there was this major conflagration where it looks like the interior of the Broch went up in flames, and went up in flames rapidly. We have very well preserved both structural timbers, but also charred animal bone, that kind of thing, and very sort of rich plant macrofossil remains. So the analysis of this thick charcoal deposit that overlay the final occupation layers has really been quite valuable in terms of reconstructing what was in the structure. So this is us sampling the charcoal deposit before we got down into those occupation layers. And because we took samples from each of these 25 centimeter, or sorry, 50 centimeter grids, squares, we're able to get really quite good resolution on the distribution of the plant macrofossil remains across the interior. Some of the conditions of preservation also kind of show us that this burning event happened quickly, and it happened so quickly that that everything that was in use that day went on fire. So there was literally grain in this knocking stone. This is a mortar used for preparing grain for processing, and it was full to the brim with charred cereal remains. So, this thing was in use on the day that it went on fire. This isn't a building that stood derelict for decades before one day someone sets fire to it. This was very much the final event in the site's history. One of the fun things we've done over the past year was with Historic Ascent was to think about how that interior could have been arranged. And we spent some time building replica wicker panels, and these are based on the charcoal macrofossils that come from this excavated deposit. So almost exclusively the charcoal is small round wood. There's very little in the way of big chunky timbers. There's the famous reconstruction drawing of a broch done by Alan Braby, which shows Doon Carloway in cutaway profile, and it has these great big substantial floorboards, planks lining the interior. And while that might have been the case for some brochs, it certainly wasn't at Clachtol. There's nothing substantial about any of the timbers here. So we're very much sort of seeing this as, very lightweight wicker wattle architecture inside the broch. So we reconstructed some of these, built a scarcement for these to interact with in the same way that they would have done in the broch when it stood. And then after letting them dry out, set fire to them with some pots on these floors to try and replicate something of the process of it going on fire. And it was really quite dramatic. It took something like 10 minutes before the fire was so extensive that the major structural timbers are burning right through, and the floors are falling down into the interior, smashing the pots and everything in between. So it doesn't take long. Basically, what you've got is effectively a giant dry stone blast furnace, and as soon as it goes on fire, you don't have long to get out. That's very much in evidence from some of the other areas of the site. That this is cell 2, the big tall one that I mentioned at the start, where we have the evidence of rebuilding. And in there, we've got these really sort of strange deposits. There's this charred concentration of grain, a bit like we found in the knocking stone, but also this kind of fluffy grey deposit, which we weren't sure what we were dealing with when we excavated it. And during the post-excavation analysis, it's become clear that what that was a bound sheaf of grain, of cereal. So this is like sheafs of barley being stored in the cell, ready for processing. And the heat of the fire has basically fused that with the sand surrounding it. So we have these really well preserved ears of barley fused into the surrounding sand. And this concentration of barley here, we think may even have been a standing bag of grain. So obviously the bags burnt away, charred the barley inside, and left it sitting on the floor of the cell. So really what we sort of think about this as a storage area. You know, this is where foodstuffs like the grain that's ready for processing are stored in the kind of cool, dark environment in the cell. So really quite spectacular stuff. I mean, this isn't the kind of thing you find in your average Iron Age roundhouse excavation. The other good thing about the burning event from the archaeologist's point of view is that it gives us this really clear sealing deposit. So everything that we excavated has to have predated that burning event. And that gives us some handle on how to model our radiocarbon dates. So before I sort of talk at too much length about the radiocarbon dates, so just to illustrate that these are the full distribution of all the dates we've obtained. Okay, so the main occupation sequence that I've just described is represented by this group of dates in the center here. And I've shown them here on a radiocarbon calibration curve. So this is how they plot when the raw dates themselves are calibrated using the calibration software. So you can see that the dates are spanning this sort of 200 BC up to sort of, you know, the late 2nd century AD in the range. But you'll also notice these outliers. The first of which is this one around about 400 AD, a single date, probably from something which has trickled down from above, bears no relationship to any of the internal deposits. But also these curious two early outliers. So these are falling around about 400 BC. And I'll ask you to sort of bear those in mind because, again, I'm going to come back to them later. So one of the good things about having this highly sort of stratified sequence of deposits is that being able to very accurately position the dating samples in relation to each other through this occupation sequence allows us to kind of model these radiocarbon dates. If you imagine that this date for phase 1 has to be earlier than this date for phase 2, even though the laboratory has given a potentially earlier date for phase 2. So that allows us to kind of refine the distribution of errors in our radiocarbon dating. And when you do that exercise, what you end up with is this distribution. Now, I'm kind of conscious that this slide is a bit small to read. So if I just kind of use my pointer here to show that where we had the dates before spanning from here around about 200 BC up to around about 200 AD, that was this whole range here. By using this modeling technique, this stratigraphic correction, as it were, for the errors in the radiocarbon dates, these dates suddenly pull right down. So where we've got a range of a couple of centuries error, we're now talking about a couple of decades. So the interior occupation, that's everything from the very lowest bedrock and the first primary hearth, right the way up to hearth 3 and the burning event, all happened almost certainly within the last 5 decades of the 1st century BC. You'll see the latest dates in that range just clip into the 1st century AD. But if I was to place money on that, I would say that by the turn of the millennium, this broch is burnt and out of use. So again, this increased precision in our dating is really important for allowing us to get a handle on exactly what was happening there, when it was happening, and when it stopped happening. So I mentioned the richness of the burning deposit and the advantages of sampling that in a grid in the way that we did in the field was that we were able to plot where the individual plant and charcoal types appear within the interior. And these are showing us some really interesting patterns in terms of storage areas and unlikely processing areas. So it seems quite clear that the processing and consumption areas of for cereal, for example, are on the north and west side of the interior of the broch. Whereas there's some indication that storage was happening, you know, on the south and the east side. So these are kind of, again, really useful insights into what was happening in the interior. Turning to look at the artifacts then, again, it feels a bit like a labor of the point, but the importance of this snapshot idea. So the fact that we've got this tight chronology for the interior use of the Broch at Clachtal gives us this really good indication of what objects were in use at any one time. And one of the interesting things is that the ceramics that we've recovered from that sequence, that occupation sequence, amount to probably less than 20 and maybe only 12 individual vessels. So if you compare that to somewhere like Loch na Beary, where Edinburgh University excavated for many years in the 90s, they were measuring their pottery finds in the cubic meter. So there's a different scale of pottery use going on. And there's lots of interesting possibilities for why that might be. But personally, I think it's all down to the fact that what we have at Clachtal is a very short duration of occupation. I think that the Broch as we see it now comes into use probably around about 50 BC, and it's gone by the turn of the millennium. The other interesting stuff about the pottery is that it shows some quite strong similarities, mainly to the Hebrides, but not exclusively. There are some aspects of the pottery which does look like forms that you can find in Orkney and Caithness assemblages, but by and large, it's much more similar to the Hebrides. And that, for obvious reasons, you can understand why that affinity would be there, but it shows a very close connection between the communities that were living in the Outer Hebrides and living on the mainland at that point. And again, I'll come back to that in my discussion. Some of the more prosaic objects, we have a very large number of spindle whorls, but these are also giving us important information about the character and status of this building. So we have spindle whorls in several stages of production. So we have the raw materials gathered for creating them. We have roughouts for creating spindle whorls. We have some which were clearly being made at the time of the Broch's abandonment, and we have really quite finely finished and nicely decorated examples too. So this is something that shows, this is a kind of day-to-day industry. This is people producing practical, useful objects for use on site. And to me, that's, these day-to-day objects are important in characterizing what sort of structure we're dealing with and what sort of group. The same can be said of the iron objects, and it's important to kind of pause and consider those, because the iron itself is actually very unusual, and iron just doesn't survive, generally speaking, to any great extent in Scottish soils very well, because they tend to be quite acidic. That you often hear a kind of cliche that there's no iron in the Iron Age in Scotland, but actually what this tells you is there's plenty of iron around. Not that we needed to guess that. We see it from in sort of proxy evidence on woodworking and that kind of thing in certain waterlogged sites, but it's very unusual to get the actual objects themselves preserved. But what they do show is that, this is a toolkit we're talking about. It's a range of functional objects. Some of the nicer ones, these iron reaping hooks, and again, this is tying people to the land, so this is very much a farming community. These are the tools that they use for gathering the sheaves of barley that we've seen well preserved in the charred evidence. And also much more substantial things, like these are long-hafted scythes. These ones were found in a group, quite sort of fused together, but this drawing on the top left here shows in cross-section how they were socketed, and they're quite big bladed things. It's quite unusual. There's only a handful of examples of scythes on this sort of scale, from anywhere in Iron Age Britain. So, what this does is it's giving us an insight into the kind of everyday tools that are around much more widely in Iron Age Britain, but not often preserved. A nice couple of finds that came to light as well are these what were fairly unassuming fragments of iron accreted to rock when they were collected, but in the post-ex analysis turns out these are the remains of shears. So again, I spent a bit of time just drawing attention to the iron objects, because to me they look like workshop tools. These are functional, practical things that you would find in a farmhouse. designed to do a range of activities, you know, from woodworking, from felling, to agricultural purposes like crop harvesting. Another aspect of the finds assemblage has been the information that we've got from these steatite cups and lamps. So we've got quite a range of these kind of worked stone vessels, and some of them are quite nicely made. They range from being, you know, fairly roughly hacked out of steatite. Some of them are of sandstone, of the local Assynt sandstone, but mostly of steatite. But some of them are very carefully polished and worked, and some of them have decoration on them. Now, these things have always traditionally been called lamps. If you read about brochs, you'll always hear that one of the standard parts of a broch assemblage is the stone lamp or the steatite lamp. Really, the preservation conditions that we see at Clachtoll have allowed us to do new types of analysis on the interiors of these objects, and that's giving us information about what they might have been for, and it's pointing to something a bit more complicated than lamps. So you can see the residue analysis. This is done by taking very sort of small samples of the fatty residues adhering to the interior of the vessels, and analyzing these based on the ratios of isotopes in them. And from that analysis, we can see that they've been used to store various fats, including marine fats, possibly like whale blubber, that kind of thing, but also pork fat, that kind of thing. And we're getting evidence for dairy as well. So while they could be lamps, some of them are very certainly not used for lighting purposes, and could well be for, you know, the kind of storage of things like butter. One other interesting, before I go into that slide, one other interesting issue about the steatite lamps is that there was hints that some of them may have held beeswax as well. So that again is a kind of proxy piece of evidence for not only the cultivation or the keeping of bees, but also might suggest that, you know, that there are other uses for wax, as in like sealing things like butter and butter products into these vessels. So again, kind of changing our perception of what some of these standard artifact types are for. A wide range of bone implements too, again in various states of preservation, some of them burnt and broken, but some of them almost complete and unburnt. So this very nice bone weaving comb, and again close inspection of these is giving us good indications as to what they were used for. You can see these very narrow striations on the teeth of these combs show that they're used for drawing out threads and fibre. So they're used in the weaving process. Quite unusually as well, we had some organic survival from various parts of the structure. So in some of the drain deposits in the floors, and also in cell 1 where the deposits were quite wet, we've actually been able to recover spun fibre. So this is actually animal fibre spun into thread. So again, we have the connection between the spindle whorls on site and then the final product, which is, you know, creating these fibers for spinning and weaving. And also this image in the bottom left here is of a range of wood fragments. The wood itself as an assemblage is interesting, and we could talk at length about that, but it includes possible bowl fragments, so wooden vessels being used at this site as well, but it also includes driftwood. So there's actually larch in this assemblage. So this is you know, non-native species which has been collected as driftwood off the beach and then converted down into sort of artifacts and possibly even structural material. So again, because of the way we recorded the site, we're able to sort of plot some of the distributions of these artifacts, and that's given us an insight into how the interior of the building was used, and kind of in keeping with the patterns emerging from the plant analysis. It's looking very much like the northern and western parts of the interior, where people spent time. This is where the pins and the combs come from. Most of the ceramics come from the southern part of the Broch in this area here. Almost all of the iron objects come from one area in the southern quadrant here. So this very much to me looks like, a storage area. There's probably like a cupboard or something like that, a rack where all these iron tools were hung up on the day that the Broch burnt down. And again, similarly, rotary querns, the distribution of those almost exclusively from the south and west part of the Broch interior, and that tallies again quite nicely with the plant macrofossil patterns. Just a couple of other highlights to draw your attention to. This was Jen's find from the Broch, and this is actually a cetacean bone sword pommel. So this is the kind of the decoration of that goes at the base of the hilt of a small sword or a dagger, and it's made out of the tooth of a small cetacean, as in a porpoise or dolphin. This bronze pin as well, one of the nicest metal objects that came from the Broch. The XRF analysis, where we're able to look at the metallic composition of the object, has shown us that it's made from a leaded bronze. And again, this is an important thing for to bear in mind in archaeology, that views change. This was an object that was always thought to be this kind of leaded bronze was always thought to be post-Roman in date, so it doesn't come into use in Scotland before the Romans appear. But as you've seen from our radiocarbon dates, even at the very latest, we're talking about the first decade or so into the first century AD. So there was very much this type of bronze in circulation and in use in Scotland well before the Romans. So advances on what we know about metallurgy as well. The other nice thing about this pin is that you can see that it connects people to the other objects on the site. And this is part of a kind of wider picture that we're getting of the connection of this community to the wider kind of Broch culture across the Atlantic north and west. So I've already talked about the similarities between the pottery in the Western Isles and at Clachtal. But also the sword pommel is very similar, in fact so similar that it must have been created to a similar design, as examples I've found in Shetland and Orkney and other places. And the bronze pin itself is an example of an object where this has been used to decorate the pot, some of the pots that must have been made on site, because the match between that object and the decoration is so close that this is tying the people that wore this object to the manufacture of the pottery on site. So all of that kind of run through the artifact assemblage, and what the main conclusion that I want to sort of draw to you is that this is an assemblage that's very much domestic in nature. There's nothing about this that looks like it isn't a place where people lived and worked. Many of the objects are about production, whether they're spindle whorls or whether they're tools. They're sort of prosaic in nature. These are things that are used by working people for practical purposes. There's very little about it that looks flashy or high status. But it's also very varied, and that tells you, it's a good example of us looking at the complete cross section of the assemblage of objects that people in this Broch would have used. Just want to turn to look at this site in its regional or immediately local context before turning to the discussion. And it's just important to mention that we looked at some of the other sites in the area as well, including the Split Rock, which has the remains of vitrified walling on top of it. This is Finn and Jen excavating up there on a nice day in the summer. And this is a sherd of pottery, one of a couple that they found from the small trench that they excavated up on this on this kind of stack fortification just to the south of the Broch. And the pottery is very much of the same style as the stuff that we were getting from the Broch, and it's almost certainly contemporary. Not too far away at Clashnessie, this small dune fortification, what we would call a dune in this sort of traditional terminology. Again, a small excavation there to try and establish whether we're dealing with something broadly contemporary. Just not too far from Clachtall, just on the other end of the Stour Peninsula. And a small excavation that Historicascent carried out at Loch na Clash as well. So again, this is a kind of artificial island settlement with a sort of a fairly chunky dry stone wall built on top of this kind of island in the small Peaty Loch. I'm not going to say too much about those excavations other than to draw your attention to the radiocarbon dates for them. Because if you take this top date here, this is for the kind of median of the radiocarbon dates for Clachtall. The radiocarbon dates for the Split Rock, Clashnessie, and 2 dates for Loch na Clash. And you can see if I just sort of draw this kind of medium line through, it's very likely, in my opinion, that these sites were in use broadly at the same time. So we're looking at a kind of a landscape of occupation in the Stour Peninsula and around Clachtall around about the 1st century BC. So just to kind of the last part of my talk, I just wanted to kind of come back to some of the big questions in Broch archaeology and think about how Clachtall kind of contributes to those big questions. And to us, the big questions are really when and why these things came about. Broch archaeology has a long and controversial past in academia. Lots of raging debates about these big questions of when and why they were built. And just to kind of sort of paraphrase a bit of historiography of how Broch archaeology comes to be where it is, it's important to think about where our conclusions or our interpretations have their origins. And through the second half of the 20th century, largely through the work of Ewan Mackay and others, this idea that Brochs were an introduction from the south of the UK came into being. Okay, so this is largely drawn from the comparison of pottery types in Wessex in the Upper Thames in the south of England with Iron Age pottery in the Western Isles. So based on this kind of typological comparison between the kinds of objects that were turning up in these two places, this whole theory developed throughout the 20th century, that Brochs must be an introduction from the south. And that this kind of grew into the conventional wisdom that Brochs must be based on invaders establishing new settlements, and that therefore they couldn't really predate the 1st century BC when these artifact types were in use in the south of England. So that constrains us into this 1st century BC horizon. So by the sort of 70s and 80s, it was more or less the conventional wisdom that Brochs were the castles of this ruling elite that had established itself over the kind of local communities of the north and west in Scotland, displaced by activities happening in the south of England. But suspicion began to sort of arise that this was maybe not quite an accurate view, and this was largely through the work of people like Dennis Harding and Ian Armitt in the 1990s. And what Ian Armitt did was to look closely at the range of Brochs, dunes, and kind of related structures that you find across the north and west, and considered the sort of structural and characteristics of those buildings, and what he was able to do, or what he was able to theorize, was that there's so much more similarity in the small dunes and complex Broch towers than there are differences. And when you start to include these things under this sort of umbrella term of the Atlantic Roundhouse, you start to be able to relate these buildings to each other in one chronological horizon. And the other implication of that was that chronological horizon couldn't be as late as the 1st century BC. One major important point from this new direction about thinking about Brochs then is that if you look in areas like Orkney or North Uist and other parts of Atlantic Scotland, there's just so many of these buildings that while not all Brochs are equal, the simple equation, that the Broch is the settlement of a ruling elite just doesn't stand. It doesn't work. They can't all be high status settlements, particularly when we can't point to any other settlements which were subordinate to those settlements. So that's how this kind of this idea that the Broch is a kind of symbol of local authority began to kind of develop. A much more kind of sophisticated view of Iron Age society, which is much more sensitive to the social framework that resulted in it, than just simply imposing an external stimulus on it. I think to me this quite kind of often sort of shines a light on the way that archaeologists can be so narrow-minded about explaining things, our inability to move beyond our own frame of reference. If something's big and complicated and difficult, then it must equate to wealth, control and coercion, and therefore it must be something that belongs to a king. And if you think about it and you look at the evidence on its own basis, there's nothing to support that at all. All Broch assemblages are broadly similar, and I've already described how at Clactol we have this kind of prosaic sort of day-to-day assemblage. They don't look like high status settlements. So even more than that, this drawing this kind of argument through to its conclusion, when you look closely at Broch structures where we're able to see them in their most unmodified forms, and some of the most recent excavations, the more modern excavations such as that at Scatness in Shetland, which recently been published, and Martin Carruthers' work at the Cairns in Orkney as well is another site which is going to really transform how we think about Brochs. But where we see this original generation of Broch towers, it looks like there's such a thorough and kind of profound the engineering and architecture of them that there may well have been one original Broch design from which all the others, are contemporary with, and that leads us to think that there might even have been a single kind of flourish, a major Broch generation. And one of the things that the modern excavations like Scatness and others are pointing to is that original generation was early. It was much earlier than Ewan Mackay saw it. At Scatness, it may even have been as early as the 5th century BC, but it was certainly by around about 300 BC. So again, a different chronological horizon to the one that the conventional wisdom would have forced Brochs into. So when we break this association between Brochs and the 1st century Wessex settlers, then you see we also break the interpretation with them being imposed on local society by wealthy incoming elites. So where does Clactol fit into this, and what's its contribution to this kind of argument then? Well, first of all, the dating itself is really important for us, So I've just explained how we may well be, or we can now be confident in pushing the origins of Brochs back into the much earlier Iron Age, so perhaps as early as 500, but certainly by 300 BC. But Clactol illustrates quite neatly why that's difficult, because what we have at Clactol is a very tightly dated occupation sequence, which is much later. It's in the 1st century BC, and probably and certainly the second half of the 1st century BC. So you can see how it would be easy to be fooled into assuming that the Iron Age structures like Brochs are later in date than they actually are. There's always going to be a natural tendency for us to date towards the latest occupation. And that is all based on the importance of the structural analysis of the Broch. Okay, so while we look at the building that survives at Clactol, it's important to recognise that while it's a Broch, it's definitely not the Broch. There's so much evidence from across the structure of it being redesigned, remodelled and rebuilt. it's been rebuilt as a broch using much of the features of a broch, but it's been rebuilt on a precursor monument, and to me that suggests that, you know, everything about it is a kind of is an emulation of the original concept and original foundation settlement. So we know from our analysis of the structure and the dating of the associated deposits that we're dealing with this sort of Middle Iron Age, this last few decades of the 1st century BC building, but we also know quite clearly that that wasn't the original building. And that's why these outlier dates that I mentioned earlier are so significant. So these 2 dates that we have back here, we can't tie them to any of the deposits that we've excavated inside the broch. They don't belong with those deposits. But to me, what they're doing is they're pointing to, you know, they're hinting at the original foundation of that settlement. Now, these are samples from burnt bone, which were intermingled with the flooring deposits. And I suspect, although there's obviously never going to be any way to prove this, that what this represents is the residual remains of that 1st generation broch that belongs with the original earlier Iron Age horizon. But the other thing about that is that it tells us how brochs are really important fixed points in the landscape. So Iron Age settlement geography seems to have been quite durable. In other areas like Caithness, where we've excavated brochs and associated structures, we see this chronology extending over decades, centuries. You know, this example at Nibster over in Caithness, the occupation extends well into the Pictish period. So this is an example of how, you know, these important places, not necessarily continuously in use, but repeatedly in use. They were always important points in the landscape. And these are kind of like really quite remarkable insights into drawing, you know, almost like a map of what's essentially, or what is, a pre-literate and pre-cartographic society. So really quite important glimpses of prehistoric society from these buildings. And again, thirdly, the similarity of the material culture of the broch, you know, it points to this system of contacts across the northern Atlantic region, and thinking about how these things come about and how they're built, and what the mechanisms are for them appearing. I think there are probably clues in this material culture. Trade's very likely, so it's almost certain that these people were in regular contact, exchanging objects. But the other way to think about it is that we know the pottery was being manufactured on site, and very typically in kind of pre-industrial, pre-market economies, things like pottery, the kind of day-to-day domestic objects, would be manufactured by women. And it's possible that this is kind of just like an insight into how some of the people movement and kinship ties might have brought about the construction of brochs as sources of labour and cooperation, even across quite large areas. So it would be quite easy to imagine people from the Western Isles aligning themselves in kind of political terms and through kinship ties with communities on the mainland. So the material culture, again, just to emphasize this point, is that this idea of a snapshot of it gives us a really good insight into what the character of this broch was, and everything to me points to it being a functional farmstead type settlement. The remains of the plants that we see being used and processed on them are at every stage from harvest right through to final product. So it doesn't look like a kind of central place where people are bringing, you know, tributes or products in a finished state. This is a self-sufficient building with its own associated land, which was being farmed by the people who lived there. And one final thought then that I just want to end with is just what brought all of this to an end. So we talked about Clashnessie, Loch na Clash, and the sites around Clachtog. So very clearly a contemporary occupied landscape. We can't really be sure or ever be sure what caused that fire. But it seems that some sort of catastrophic event brought the occupation of the Broch to an end, and then it wasn't occupied again. And that's an important point, because the dates for those other settlements as well suggest to me that because they're broadly contemporary with the Broch, that this was the very end of the Iron Age use of this area of Assynt. And so what we're looking at, I mean, you could never be certain, but this burning event that happens at the Broch seems more and more likely to be related to some kind of political change. And I wouldn't be surprised if it was to do with a new group taking over, or people being forced from their land. And that's why we see these sites as a whole being abandoned around about the same time, and no one going on to use them in later periods, at least not for a very long time. And really, this is interesting to me because that's about as close as you get in prehistoric Scotland to, you know, identifying political events in the physical archaeology that you find in the ground. Ewan Mackay, give him his credit, identified Clachtal as having this potential. In his discussion of the Atlantic Iron Age in 2010, he saw that that what we need was a site that might mark the closure of Iron Age activity on these sites. He was discussing it in the context of a very late Iron Age horizon around about the 6th century. It turns out that he probably should have been looking slightly earlier, but his point was correct. Clachtal was the site to address some of these questions. So all of this discussion that I just wanted to just put to you tonight just is kind of points towards this much more nuanced appreciation of what Brochs in Iron Age settlement were. So, you know, the idea that these are elite castles belonging to powerful kings surely now has to be long gone. And the more effort that we put into the analysis of the stuff that comes from these settlements, the more that picture is reinforced. You know, we're dealing with self-sufficient communities, but probably in a system of collaboration and cooperation and community cohesion. And that's the way to think about these Brochs. They're symbols of community, much more than symbols of elite ruling power. And that's where I wanted to end it. Thank you.